Autism spectrum disorder has been changing over the last few years. Several things have been combined into one diagnosis. High functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome are now one diagnosis. Have a look at the list around this diagram. You'll see several that I've been talking about over the last several years. These are considered either part of the autistic spectrum, overlapping, or comorbid. Comorbid is not as bad as it sounds. It simply means multiple ailments that occur together in one person. Myself, I've been diagnosed with extreme autism, ADHD inattentive type, severe depression, anxiety disorder, and specific learning difficulties, which includes 2 different types of dyslexia. OCDs are definite. Auditory processing, which basically means what you hear you don't always understand as simply or as quickly. It might take some moments before you can sort of translate it into language that your brain understands. Tourette's is worth a question, and it's definitely gifted. Have an unusually high IQ with touches of savant syndrome. Sensory integration disorder is basically sensory inputs from outside simply being too much or too overwhelming to be able to cope with. You'll hear of a great many mothers who can only buy natural clothing, no synthetics, or cutting the labels off the backs of shirts because the sensory input of that tag is too much for an autistic person to cope with. There you go. All these years you've been wondering why I understand these kids so well. Here you'll see quite a list of the different aspects that affect people with autism. Repetitive behaviours. Anxiety is probably the largest feature. There's a few here you probably haven't heard of. Difficulty with transitions, e.g. changing from one thing to the other, which we do a lot of on camp. That one, it basically means repetitive verbiage or words that they say to themselves or say to others again and again. Stimming is short for stimulating or self-stimulating, trying to ease their tension or anxiety by doing usually a repetitive action, tapping feet, jiggling their legs, or playing with a string or fidget spinners, that kind of thing. Another of the really big ones is reading social cues. They don't really get that non-verbal language, whether someone's angry or happy or subtexts. For autism, simply say exactly what you mean. They take things extremely literally, so if you say something like, hey, let's jump into the car, they'll literally jump and not just get in. Hyperfixations will be a particular something or other that they have an extreme interest in. One boy I used to work with, I could pick any railway station anywhere in Melbourne and he would tell me the time of the next train that would arrive. That's how fixated he was on the train timetable. He had memorised the whole lot. This can be very useful as a discussion point or to engage them in an interest at their level. For the most part, the neurological disorders are the realm of boys. As you can clearly see in this diagram, there's a vast number more boys who suffer from these neurological depressions on the whole. Usually, the best way to handle kids with these kinds of problems is to remain very calm and quiet, speak very clearly. Someone who is experiencing a sensory overload will appreciate this amount of calm, so you do not add to their overload. Explain things in detail, what is happening, why it's happening. Particularly explain what is about to happen. This fear of the unknown and whether they'll be able to cope with it is a large part of autism. Be very clear, because these kids often think in ways that will be considered very odd. As mentioned earlier, they often have an auditory processing disorder, what I would call expressive receptive language disorder. It takes a little time for them to understand language in the way that their brain makes sense of it. It's likely you'll have to repeat things multiple times. Use examples that they're already familiar with, maybe experiences that they will do at school. It is important to be somewhat flexible to fit in with the needs of these kids. A lot of the problems they experience in life is that they do not fit the system that has been made for them. Schools are particularly difficult for kids with autism. Camps are very different, change a lot, fast-paced, and can be easily overloading. If they need some time out, they may need a smaller environment with less stimulus, things like that. Make agreements. Suggest a course of action or behaviour and say, can you do that for me? Or will you agree to do that? Kids are far more likely to follow along if they have agreed to it. You can always bring them back to remind them that you agreed to do it this way. We are working in partnership. This is not a lord and master relationship. This can be a very challenging process, even exhausting. There's a great variety of symptoms and a great variety of extremity of those symptoms. Rarely are two children with autism the same. They must realise, and you must realise, that you have limits also. Don't be afraid to let them know that you are reaching your limits. Know when you are getting close to your limits. We have a large team of leaders, level 4s, grandmas, grandpas, directors. Even the other kids in your group can help manage these kids.